Hello, everybody. It's really nice to meet you virtually on the screen. It's really great pleasure for me to always speak to people in Malaysia. I, as Professor Khan said, was born and brought up in Malaysia. I was born in Kota Baru, Kelantan, and then moved over to Batu Gajah in Perak. And that's where I went to school and came over to Australia to study. So the topic I want to talk to you about today is psychological safety. And let me start by asking you a few questions. I want you to answer these questions in your own mind. Have you ever been in a meeting where you have given a suggestion and the suggestion was ridiculed? Have you ever been in a learning environment where you have brought up the fact that you are struggling and perhaps don't understand something and it was laughed at? Have you ever been in a situation where there has been negative stereotypes about your ethnicity? Have you ever been in a situation where you had the idea to a problem, where you had the answer to it, but you did not contribute? If you can answer yes to those questions, then perhaps you have experienced what it's like to be in a team that's not psychologically safe. So this topic of psychological safety is really, really important in these days of the pandemic. And let me give you two different views of it. So on one side, people say there is now a tremendous level of psychological safety because we are seeing everybody on a tiny square. So there is a level of equality, so that if I want to push back or if I want to disagree, I can do that easily. On the other hand, there is an argument that says because everybody is on a tiny screen, we cannot build rapport. It's much more difficult to build trust. And because the world is going through such a flux, I better keep my mouth shut and my nose clean and not say anything just in case something happens to my job. So two different points of view. And what I would like to do with you today is talk to you about psychological safety and have you think about how can you in fact apply that in your teams. And we've called it leadership. Not that leadership is not a title, it's actually a way of thinking. Okay, so let me just bring up my deck. Go. I hope you can see that clearly now. So what is my intention of the presentation? It's to increase your level, your awareness, your knowledge of psychological safety, but also to actually look at how and what can I do to increase it in my teams. So in other words, most of you are at the university, right? So as a university, either as an academic or as a student, one of the things we really want to be conscious of doing is it's a learning institution. So how can we create psychological safety in our learning institutions so that we are free to innovate, so that we are free to try new ideas? Because of course, that's what the world is going to need as we try to navigate our way out of this current storm. So my outline is going to be really, I'm going to set up some context. I'm going to talk to you about teams and then psychological safety, and then how can you apply some of those things in your own workplace. And of course, we will have time for questions and answers after that. Some quick guidelines. Firstly, participate actively. What do I mean by that? Because we are all now doing webinars and we are all on Zoom, it's very easy just to sit back and listen. Learning is an active process. In other words, you can't just sit back and be passive and say, just teach it to me. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. You need to actively engage with the material. You need to kind of think, well, does that make sense? Do I agree with that? Maybe I don't agree with it. And what does that actually mean? So in other words, develop the mindset of a learner. Ask yourself the question, what can I learn from this? How can I apply it? And of course, the final point of look after yourself, right? So if you've been sitting for a long time, and make sure you're standing up, making sure you're stretching. So look after yourself, make sure you're keeping yourself hydrated. Now, I'd like to just find out firstly, who is in the room? So can you perhaps just put either into the chat function or into the Q&A, where are you dialing in from? I'm curious. Where are you coming in from? From the office. Thank you very much. Asnida, but where is the office? In Cyberjaya and Kuala Lumpur? Where? Cyberjaya. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Johor. Okay, City, welcome. KL, Kota Kinabalu. Okay, great. Over in West Malaysia, Sarawak. Kuching, okay. I've been to Kuching. I used to do consulting work for Shell over there. Oh, Muar, yes, they have good food there in Muar. Johor, great. Batu Pahat, fantastic. Oh, really great. Another person from Sarawak as well. Oh, Cyberjaya also in Kuching, terrific. Kota Kinabalu, yes, great. I want to one day walk up Mount Kota Kinabalu, but I have not done that as yet. So hopefully when COVID is over, we will be able to do that. My last trip to Malaysia was actually last year, just before the pandemic in January. I went back to visit some of my friends there because my parents have obviously passed on. So, but I went to visit their graves and visit my friends. So it's always great. I love visiting Malaysia. So thank you everyone for responding. And as Professor Khan said, please put your questions in the Q&A, because I'm going to just talk for a little while, give you some concepts and constructs. But of course, all learning is really based on discussion. You know, it's really good when we can kind of discuss the concepts and the ideas, because what I would like you to do is think about how do I bring the questions, the concepts to life, right? Because otherwise it's very much as an abstract. Now, some of you may have heard this term called the Wuka world. Okay, I'm just going to move that. The Wuka world. We live in a Wuka world, which stands for a place of volatility. The world right now is very volatile. It's uncertain, it's complex, and it's ambiguous. And I know that you know that, and I know that, because we are all trying to navigate our ways out of this. Governments are trying to think about what is it that we can do to help our citizens. And it's a global pandemic. And of course, this has been going on now for literally 18 months. And how do we work our way out of it? Okay. But what I want to do is I want to just draw your attention to complexity. And the reason I want to draw your attention to complexity is to give you the distinction between complexity and complicated. So this is a photograph of the Boeing A380. This is when we used to be able to fly airplanes that used to be in the air. You will notice that it has 4 big jet engines. This is a very complicated piece of machinery. However, if something went wrong with one of those engines, you would be able to look in the manual and be able to find a way or follow the process on how to correct the fault. This is a shoal of fish. This is an example of complexity. Because actually you can't work out where does it start, where does it end, what is it that makes all those fish come together and swim together like that. So you may have noticed flocks of birds flying in the air. That is also a great example of complexity, where you can't actually make sense of it. There's something that happens, it's a way of working, and somehow it seems to work. Human beings are complex. What do I mean by that? That means sometimes what you can work and say with one person doesn't work with someone else. And I'm sure you know that already. Or what worked well with one team of people doesn't actually work well with another team of people. And you think to yourself, why doesn't it work? It's because we are complex human beings. Now, the key is that for all innovations, for all of us, we work in teams. None of us work individually. So I've been an independent consultant now for 30 years. As Professor Khan said, I've been very fortunate. I've worked in many countries, literally 40 countries around the world. And although I'm independent, I have an assistant, but I always work with teams of people. So I tend to scale up on a project. I bring people in on projects, and then I scale down. And I always work with teams of people in my client organizations. So you're always working with groups of people, because you and I know that to get outstanding results of any sort, we need to be working in teams, because by ourselves, we can only achieve this much, but with a team, you can achieve much more. So when we talk about teaming, or the concept of teaming, is how do we coordinate people, right? So that they are cross boundaries, they are cross cultures, they are cross expertise, they are cross status, because that's what you need when you want high-performing teams. But let alone high-performing teams, maybe we don't want high-performing teams. Perhaps we just want high-functioning teams, so that the teams are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Now, I'm sure all of you have heard of Google. I'm sure all of you would use Google, and Google were really curious to find out what is it that makes some teams really high-functioning and other teams stumble. So they did a tremendous amount of research. They actually studied 197 teams. And they came up with a number of things. They came up with actually 5 different things that impacted high-performing teams. The first thing was actually around psychological safety. That is, the members of the team feel safe in the team. They're willing to take risks, they're willing to be vulnerable, and they're able to put up their hands when they're not sure of things, and they're able to say when they have made mistakes. The second aspect of effective teams is actually around dependability. So that means I can count on the people on my team. If they say they're going to do something, I can count that that is going to happen. In other words, they are dependable. The third aspect was around structure and clarity. So what that means is people are clear. Okay, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I have. And I know what all our different roles are. The fourth aspect was around meaning. So what that means is, the work is important to people. People in a team, regardless of what their roles are, they feel like, yes, what I do is really kind of important, which then links into the last point, which is around impact. Members think that their work matters and creates change. For many years, I consulted to an organization in Sweden called Autoliv. They are the world's largest manufacturers of seat belts, airbags, and now steering wheels, right? They were the very first people who invented seat belts back in 1956. They operate in about 66 different countries around the world. And a lot of the work that they do on their production plants is actually a production plant, and they're fixing things, making the seat belts and making the airbags, right? So it's not actually very glamorous work. It's actually quite tedious work. However, one of the things that they have, if you go to any of their factories around the world, one of the things that all the people who work with them would say is, what we do is we save lives. Okay, so that's the mantra. We save lives. So regardless of what their jobs were and how tedious it was, they knew that the work that they did was important, that it made a difference. So therefore, it gave them a sense of meaning, and they knew that their work was impactful. Now, coming back to these 5 points, what the research showed, what the Aristotle project showed, was the most important factor of all these 5 was actually psychological safety. That it was by far the most important factor in effective teams. Last year, McKinsey, the consulting company, did some research. And they found that 89% of employees believe that psychological safety is essential in the workplace. Essential. 9% think it's important. 2% think it's not important. But think of that, right? That nearly 90% think it's essential. However, just 26% of leaders created psychological safety in their teams. So just for a moment, reflect on that. I want you now raise a series of questions. I asked you some of these questions at the start. I want you to see, have you experienced any of these yourself? Have you ever felt excluded in a social setting? Have you ever been afraid to ask a question? Have you remained silent when you knew the answer to the problem? Did someone else get credit for something you did? Was a suggestion you raised ignored? Have you faced retaliation for challenging the status quo? Now, that is something I find happens quite a bit with my clients, especially in Asia Pacific. They challenge and they get retaliation from their managers. Have you ever been publicly shamed or made fun of? Have you been punished for making an honest mistake? Have you ever been made to feel inferior? I mean, a series of questions there. Now, if you could answer yes to 3, 4, 5, 6, however many, what was the impact on you as a member of the team? Okay. What was the impact? Did it motivate you? Did it get you excited? Did it make you want to contribute? Or did it, in fact, have you hold back? So, what is this thing called psychological safety? Well, let's start with what it's not. So, it's not about being nice to people. It's not a personality factor. It's not another word for trust. And it's definitely not about lowering performance standards, right? That's not what it's about. So psychological safety is actually a condition in a team where you feel included, where you feel safe to learn, where you feel safe to contribute, and where you feel safe to challenge the status quo. All without fear of being embarrassed, marginalized, or punished in any way, right? That's the definition from Tim Clark. There's another definition from Amy Edmondson from Harvard University. And she says psychological safety is a climate in which people are comfortable expressing themselves. They can share concerns. They can make mistakes without fear of embarrassment or retribution. So think about that. They can make mistakes. And as a university, as two universities, as students, surely learning, any form of learning, is about making mistakes. It is not possible to learn things without making some form of mistake, because the mistakes help us learn. As academics, as professors, as teachers, when we are teaching, part of our job is to encourage that. Now, There are some commonly held myths, right? Conventional wisdom tells us if people have something to say, well, they're going to say it. They will speak up. But here's what the research shows. People tend not to speak up, even when doing so would help others. People will speak up if you ask them to. So if you ask them to speak up, they will speak up. Leaders underestimate how hard it is to speak up. For many years, I used to run cross-cultural programs for universities here in Australia. And part of it was always working with students from Asia to actually help them to speak up, because they tend to come from countries where as students, you don't speak up, you don't challenge the teachers, you don't challenge the lecturers. But of course, in a university, it's a different environment. You are supposed to speak up. You're supposed to have rigor to the theories. You're supposed to be intellectually engaged with the materials. So therefore, speaking up would always be a key thing that all students would have to learn. Now, granted, sometimes if English is not your first language, of course, that makes it much more difficult. But actually, it's the attitude, the mindset of saying, well, how do I in fact do that? And then the last part is that if we have written rules, in other words, we have policies, we have procedures on the wall, that it would be a-okay because people will know what to do. Well, you and I know that unwritten rules are far more powerful. Think of the number of police, the number of effort that we as a society have to make just to ensure that people are maintaining COVID rules, because people love breaking rules, don't they? Put a curfew, they go out. Tell them not to get together, they do. Tell them to wear a mask, people don't wear a mask. All these things that you're constantly having to remind people. So, are there some case studies then of organizations where this has come into play? I'll just give you a couple of quick examples, right? Let me firstly start with Volkswagen, which is the logo that you see up on the top left-hand corner, one of the world's largest car manufacturers in the world. And in fact, in 2015, they were the largest manufacturer of cars in the world. And in 2016, what was discovered was that they had been falsifying their records on emission targets from their cars. So they have to meet certain guidelines to get passed by the Environmental Protection Agency, especially in the United States, and they found that they were being falsified and had been falsified for many years. Okay, and when they were able to look further into it, it was discovered that people had constantly been trying to raise it as an issue, but didn't feel safe doing so. So they took a battering on their reputation. And in fact, quite a number of senior people had to leave. Nokia. Those of you who are students here, you probably don't remember this brand. But in my generation, Nokia was a big brand. In the 90s, everybody had a Nokia phone, literally. It was the Apple of the 1990s. And they were so popular, a company from Finland. One of the things that they forgot or didn't pay attention to was actually of the new operating system that was being produced in the smartphones. So they were slow to come to the smartphone arena, and they just ignored all the reports that were coming in from their scientists. And of course, they were taken over by Microsoft. Wells Fargo is one of the oldest banks in the world. And again, there was a whole group of people that were involved in trying to get rewards as employees, and started opening false accounts for their customers because that was the way that they could win and get bonuses. And again, this was tremendous impact on the reputation of the organization. And finally, BP. BP has been a client of mine for many years. They're a great organization. However, one of the biggest disasters they had was in 2011 in the Gulf of Mexico, when one of their large platforms collapsed and there was a leakage coming from the bottom of the sea, and they couldn't quite control that. So in fact, it killed, I think it was about 11 people, and it went uncapped for about 80 days or so. It was a terrible, terrible, terrible disaster, and it nearly drove the company bankrupt, but they were able to come back from that. In the forensics, when they explored it, they found that there had been many people who had been raising the issue of safety, but due to psychological safety, didn't feel that they could raise the issue further up because the focus was purely on production. And in fact, the CEO, the new CEO who came in at that time, was a man called Bob Dudley, a geologist, a very quiet engineer. And one of the things that he talked about was listening to the quietest voice in the room. Listening to the quietest voice in the room. So right across the world, in all their operations, that became a key mantra, listening to the quietest voice in the room. And of course, they have they repaid, they fixed up the environment, they repaid their debts, and they became a successful company again. And of course, now they're re-establishing themselves to become environmentally, following the need to become again an environmentally conscious organization. So these are just some examples of large organizations where, due to psychological safety, the news that things were wrong were not able to filter up because people either didn't have the courage to speak up, or people actually didn't, in fact, listen to the situations. So when you think about teams, here is a 2x2 grid, which of course, being a consultant, I love 2x2 grids. And if you look on the x-axis, there's high psychological safety and low psychological safety. And right on the y-axis, low standards and high standards. So let's start with low psychological safety and low standards, bottom left. That is called the apathy zone. Now, what does that mean? The apathy zone means people just don't care. They can't be bothered. Who cares? I'll just turn up. I'll just do my job. I just don't care. Being apathetic. If you then move up to high psychological safety and low standards, what you get is the comfort zone. So comfort zone is people are cruising. I'm okay. I don't really have to stretch myself. I feel good. I just do what is required. Moving across to high standards and high psychological safety, this is where it's the learning and high performance zone. So this is really where you want your teams, right? This is where we get high functioning teams, high performance, innovation, creativity, ideas, pushing back, and the whole construct of creating and getting a sense of involvement, sense of meaning comes from that zone. And of course, the bottom right, which is having really high standards but low psychological safety, this is the anxiety zone. And I find that during the pandemic, there are lots of organizations or lots of people in organizations and in teams who are in the anxiety zone, because suddenly we're having to work at home. We're not having the interaction with our teams, in the office. We're having to juggle homeschooling with our families, our kids, our spouses, no interaction. We're working longer hours, and you just get into a zone. And the research shows that most people are in fact working longer. And the question becomes, of course, how productive are you being? So the challenge then is, how do we create those environments? How do we move people into perhaps learning and high performing zones? So a question for you, because I'm sure all of you belong to in teams. I'm sure you're all working as part of teams, either part of an intact team or a virtual team or a distance team. Which performance zones are your teams in? So we just want to take a moment and think about it, right? Or which quadrant do my teams fit into? And why do you think that? The other question that becomes, so what can we do to perhaps move our teams into being high performing? Now, I just want to share a couple of things here for you. So the 4 stages that we talked about of psychological safety: inclusion, learner, contributor, and challenger. And I'm going to break these down a little further. So let's start firstly with inclusion. So inclusion means the basic human need, right? People want to feel connected. They want to feel safe. And so they want to feel included. We spend a lot of time talking about diversity. So diversity is about all the ways that we are different. But inclusion is where we actually recognize, value, and appreciate difference. So, question here for you. What's 1 or 2 things you could do to increase inclusion safety in your team? Okay? What's 1 or 2 things you could do? Take a moment. See if you can write something down. What comes up to your mind? What's 1 or 2 things you could do to make people feel more included, especially given the fact that everyone's working from home? So what can you do to make people feel more included? Learner safety. That's a basic human need. Okay, we need to learn. We need to grow, because when you stop learning, you stop growing, right? You start stagnating. So part of our human condition is being part of the learning process, right? Being able to ask questions, being able to get feedback, being able to make mistakes, and being able to say, oh, wow, I made a mistake. What do I learn from that? You never, ever come to the stage in your life where you think, excuse me, never come to the stage in your life where you think, I have learned everything I need to know. Okay? Or perhaps some people do. Yeah, my bias is you can never, ever, ever learn everything there is to know. In fact, I find as I become older that I realize how little I know and how much more there is to know. So how do we actually learn more? Last year at the start of COVID, I was on a project where we were teaching 80-year-olds, right? So people who are 80 years old, how to use Zoom. Now, just think for that for a moment. Think of all those people having to actually manage a computer, getting familiar with the computer, getting familiar with a mouse, getting familiar with how to use technology. And yes, some people took a lot longer than others, but we got them all on board. And the reason why it was really important was, if it wasn't for Zoom or being able to use technology to connect with people, these individuals would not have connected with anyone. So therefore, it would not have been useful for them and would have been very, very lonely. How about being a contributor? All of us as human beings want to feel that we can contribute something. We can make a difference, that our skills and our abilities are useful for something. It may be even like, being useful in the garden, or it could be just like cooking, or it could be writing, or it could be singing, or, what can we do to contribute? Because that also makes us useful, feel useful as a human being. What are 1 or 2 things that you can do in your teams to help people feel that they can contribute more? And by the way, that was also part of learning, right? What are 1 or 2 things you could do to actually help people learn more? And then the final aspect is around being a challenger. I think as human beings, we want to make things better. And part of making things better is actually having that ability to challenge the status quo. How do we kind of say, actually, I have a better idea, or can we try something else? Or have you ever thought about this? Or have you ever thought about doing it in that way? How can we do that in a way that, and how can we encourage that? Because if you think of all innovation, if you think of all progress that we have made as human beings, it's because we've wanted something better. How can we do this better? How can we create that better? Probably came from a sense of dissatisfaction. So how do we actually encourage that in our teams? What are one or two things that we can do to encourage safety in your teams? So those are 4 reflection questions for you to be thinking about in terms of creating psychological safety in your teams. Finally, here's some suggestions, just in case you couldn't think of any. Here are a couple of things for you to think about. Choose just one of these things, right? If you just do these things, this will just help increase the safety in your teams. Inclusion safety. Ask twice as much. Express gratitude and appreciation, right? Tell your teams how much you appreciate them. Tell them how grateful you are that they are there, part of their team. So be grateful for the work that they do. Sometimes we just take people for granted. And every so often, it's just useful to stop and say, thank you. Learner safety. How can you yourself say, gosh, what are some of the things I've had to learn? And how can you sometimes say, I don't know? In today's world, it is not possible to know everything there is to know. It is just not possible. There is too much to know. So how do we actually have a level of humility and say, I just don't know the answer to that, or I don't know how to respond to that? And more importantly, is what are some of the things you need to unlearn? All of us have learned things along the way that is not useful. We come to certain stages in our lives and we have to unlearn things. And sometimes you just need to unlearn so that you can learn newer things. Contribution safety or contributor safety. Ask people what they think. Ask for opinions, right? And if people give you perhaps not the answer you're looking for, perhaps incorrect answers, don't get angry with them. Don't shame people. The mere fact that they are wanting to contribute is a good sign. Keep encouraging that. Think of children. Every time children make a mistake, we don't shame them, do we? We encourage them, right? We keep encouraging them. But sometimes I think we forget this with adults. And finally, challenger safety. When someone challenges us, when someone challenges the status quo, how do we respond in a constructive manner? Okay. How do we just not lose our temper? How do we take it on board and think about it? We may not agree with it, but how do we disagree in a nice way? The mere fact that people are challenging is a good sign. So how do we actually flip the way we look at things and in fact encourage more of that behavior? So I've come to the question and answer part. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to stop my share of the screen.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Yeah, Minesh, thank
you. That
you.
was really, really interesting. I enjoyed it. I'm pretty sure our participants did too. Participants, you can raise your questions in the Q&A section. There are already quite a few in the Q&A section. So let me just raise them to you, Dr. Tom. Okay, so the first one is from Kumaran, and the question is followed by another question from Dr. Jails. Yep. Which the question is, Kumaran asked Dr. Tom, what are the signs and risks that are associated with psychological safety? And Dr. Jails continued the question by asking, if psychological safety is of relevant importance, why are leaders in most organizations not fully supportive of, particularly in Asia? Have this got to do with much cultural domination of Asian thinking, respect to the elderly, and perhaps blindly sometimes? How do we address this in most family-run corporations, especially in Asia?
Yeah, so I think that's a relevant question. So one of the challenges is, so when we talk about culture, so culture is a way of thinking, right? So it's a shared way of thinking that a group of people adhere to. So it's not about your ethnicity, or it's not about the color of your skin, or it's not the passport that you carry, but it is a way of thinking. And in Asia, and I'm going to talk about Asia as a block, even though we know there are more than 40 countries in Asia, hierarchy is highly valued. So in other words, it's extremely difficult to challenge hierarchy. I have worked in organizations or with senior leaders in Asia where they have said things, because they work for multinationals, and so they'll say things like, well, I believe in challenge, so challenge me. If you disagree with something, go right ahead and do it. And when somebody does it, they get really angry, right? So the behavior doesn't match what they're saying. It's incongruent. Okay, it's incongruent. So it really does take a frame of mind to kind of say, okay, how do we do this? And then if I can just flip it on the other side is actually, how do we challenge respectfully, perhaps, hormat, as they say, how do we challenge it respectfully? How do we kind of do that in a way that comes across as, here's an idea. And so you need to test the waters, right? It's not something you can just go in and challenge the status quo, because people will react. So you need to understand the organization of the culture. The culture of the organization, the culture of the team, and how that plays out, and how open they are to that.
Thank you, Dr. Tom.
That answers your question. No.
All right. So the next question we have from One Wahida, which she's asking, in what way psychological safety is any different from occupational safety practices?
That's a good question. Actually, I should invite Professor Khan to answer this question, because this is his area. Occupational safety is his area. Would you like to come in and answer that question, Professor Khan?
Of course, I would like to say, in occupational safety and health, we have evolved from, firstly, called workers' involvement, then participation, and comes work engagement. So that work engagement is almost similar to what you are talking about, psychological safety, where work engagement, employees are giving their mind and soul to how to increase the organizational performance by questioning the practices that existing in the organization, looking in various other ways of how we can utilize the resources, the what we call the environment, the procedures, how to get it with effectiveness and efficiency to increase occupational performance, organizational performance, and without disturbing the status quo. Of course, we have to question, if you were to ask why we need to question the status quo, because if we do not question the status quo, we might be following blindly what has been done, maybe for some time back, and things have changed, yet we are still using the old tools for the new environment. So these are very, very important. That's why in occupational safety, they have moved on to now becomes work engagement. I think it's as your session. I should not take more than that. No, please go ahead.
Oh, great. Well, thank you for that, though. Thank you for that, Professor Khan. So again, it's about demonstrating. What I'm trying to demonstrate is sometimes that, there are many different views, right? So you want to be able to invite people to have a perspective. And I think, thank you for Professor Khan for giving us that perspective.
Thank you, Prof. Khan. All right, let's continue. Dr. Tom, I have another question from Nurul Suhada. She says, how do I maintain and promote psychological sanity within my team? And how do I do this online?
Yeah, so it's, it's one of those things that's really challenging. So you need to actually be consciously thinking about, how do I do that? So one of the things you want to kind of do, create in psychological safety is, again, it goes to the culture of the team and how big the team is. I was actually speaking to someone recently. So when I work with teams and organizations, obviously we have ground rules right at the start. And one of the things I really try to encourage people to do is actually have their cameras on, because I find having cameras on in a team, and of course, we're not talking about large teams, right? So you want to have that you can actually sort of see people. I find that makes a difference. And one of the things I always try to do is encourage diverse points of views. So when someone says one thing, I always try to see, well, does someone have an alternative point of view to that? Or does everyone agree with that? What's a different view of looking at the world? So you're trying to encourage different points of view. So it doesn't mean that they have to agree with that point of view. So sometimes I say, well, let's play a role. Okay, let's play a role. And what can you, how, if you were in that role, what would you say? So it helps people change hats. It's not as if they're putting themselves out there. They can say, well, if I was doing this, then this is what I would say. I find for me that works. So perhaps try that.
Thank you, Dr. Tom. I agree with you, because I think if we don't on the camera, unlike face-to-face where we can see somebody's face, we can see their facial expressions. We can't do that online. Yeah, so the best way to do it is to have those cameras on. I completely agree with you on that one. Since we're running out of
to that point, Vinesh, I find in many a time, in Asian audiences, again, and I'm generalizing, I find people are very reluctant to have their cameras on. Very reluctant. You got to really encourage people to say, come on, let's, so it's,
Thank you, Dr. Tom. So since we're running out of time, I think let's do one more question, one last one, which I'm going to put two questions together. So it's from Anissa and Noor Atika. So the question is, how do we ask questions without sounding offensive? And why is it such a struggle for people to speak up?
Well, let me just start with the second question. Okay. Why is it a struggle to speak out? So I think one of the reasons why it's a struggle to speak out is actually we don't encourage it. So we don't encourage. So if we're thinking about students, for instance, and we're talking about a class, we're talking a group, we actually don't encourage people to speak out. So we don't actually, so sometimes as a leader, we need to reach out. We need to say, okay, Noor, I'd like to hear from you. What's your view on this? Okay. Or Anissa, what's your view on this? So as the leader having to reach out saying, I am interested in hearing what you have to say. I find that actually encourages people to speak up, because the more they speak, the more confident they become, right? Because there's also a level of confidence in it. Am I confident? Can I actually say that? So that will be the first thing. And the second thing, but how do you say something without sounding offensive? Well, I think, again, a lot of it is about how you frame the question. Okay, you frame the question. And if you ask a question such as, I'm curious to know further about this. Okay, because you find when you say something like, I'm curious, most people will tend to respond. Or you'll say, oh, I find what you've said really interesting. Can I please ask another question about it? And people will, you find people will respond. So, I think that most of us who've grown up in places like Malaysia, we learn how to navigate through this very well. We just need to use more of it. In my work as a cross-cultural consultant, right? I've been a cross-cultural consultant now for 30 years. I say that one of my gifts, or one of the blessings I had, was growing up in Malaysia. Because I think growing up in Malaysia, we learn how to be culturally sensitive and how to navigate cultural differences at a very, very early age. Very early age. I was playing with people of different cultures. I was eating foods of different cultures. I was learning all these things growing up. So when I became an adult and when I came across the field, I thought to myself, wow, I never even knew such a field existed. And then when I read all the research on it, I thought, gosh, this makes perfect sense for me. So I think it's about being able to do those things and make the mistakes. And I can speak as someone who didn't go through the traditional university route. I went to university for a couple of years and I was doing the wrong course and I left and I didn't finish and all those things. I went back to university when I was 30 years old and studied part-time. Did all my studies part-time, did my master's part-time, did my doctorate part-time. It's because once you find something you're interested in, then you will work that way. But I'm so grateful because I would think there'll be many parts of the world where once you've left, you cannot enter, you cannot come back in. It's difficult. So hence, I think that's why you always need to encourage, because you never know where the next big idea is going to come from.
Thank you, Dr. Tom. I believe I speak for all the attendees in the session today. It was very enjoyable. I personally enjoyed it very much. Prof. Khan, would you like to say something before we end?
Yeah, excellent discussion. If I may summarize briefly the presentation, Dr. Tom has successfully increased our awareness and knowledge on psychological safety. That was his intention. So I think he has done a good job for that. The other part was to how to increase it in our team. So I think the takeaway that we need to consider is that the 4 stages of psychological safety, which is inclusion, number one, that is the need to connect and belong. Number 2 is learner, to learn and to grow. The unlearning process has to take place in order to give room for the new ones to settle down. And the third one is the contributor, the need to make a difference. Your presence is felt. Then the fourth one is challenger. Of course, need to make things better, but without stepping on other people's gray area. So that's the technique and the science and the arts, as what you perfectly said, that in our culture, we are trained to be like, to respect the various gray areas so that we don't fumble up, we don't hit on. I think, thank you so much, Dr. Tom, for the great presentation. And thank you to all attendees for your participation and cooperation. This presentation has come to its end. Till we meet again, stay safe and take care. Bye-bye. Selamat Hari Merdeka.
Yeah, thank you very much. I too want to say Selamat Hari Merdeka. And I also want to thank the University of Cyberjaya and also the Asian Metropolitan University for inviting me to speak. I'm grateful for that and really happy Independence Day. Thank you again.
Thank you.